Hey guys, so last episode we talked about nervous tissue. This episode we're going to talk more about the nervous system itself. This is going to be a pretty long episode, and so it'll be in two parts. This is actually going to have two presentations as well. This is the first one. Let's start anyway because I don't want to lose time. So let's first review nervous system terminology. So nerve fiber or nerve tract, those are axons in the peripheral nervous system and central nervous system respectively. Then after that, there's white matter and gray matter. So those are the myelinated parts and unmyelinated parts of neurons, respectively. Then there's nuclei and ganglia. Those are cell bodies in the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, respectively. Besides ganglia, the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is actually in your central nervous system, and um, it's just because the name just stuck. Anyway, so there's vesicles, and those are basically areas of the brain from development. And these form into these develop into adult brain structures. We'll talk about this later. So ventricles are basically cavities filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which we'll talk about later. And these develop. These are adult brain structures. Then after that, there's peduncles, and those are basically like large tracts that support structures within the brain. And think of peduncle meaning little foot, and that'll help you memorize that. So let's talk about the organization of the nervous system. So the nervous system is divided into two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system contains the brain and the spinal cord, and it's abbreviated CNS. And then after that, the peripheral nervous system is abbreviated PNS, and it contains the sensory afferent division. Afferent means it's sending signals towards the brain, and the motor efferent division. Efferent means it's sending signals outside the brain. I think of SAD-MED to memorize that. Anyway, so the afferent division is divided into the somatic sensory neurons and the visceral sensory neurons. Visceral sensory neurons are in your visceral organs, and they monitor the changes that happen here. And if any changes occur, it'll send signals towards the brain, telling the brain what changes occurred. And then after that, there are the somatic sensory neurons, and those are basically everywhere else. But either way, these tell the brain something, tell the central nervous system something. And then after that, there's the efferent nervous system, which divides into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous, these are the part of the motor efferent division. That means it's involved with movement, and it's involved with sending signals away from the brain to affect our organs. So it's just responsible for responses. Somatic nervous system is the voluntary part of the motor efferent division. So it's in charge of things like skeletal muscles, anything that's voluntary. Then after that, there's the autonomic nervous system, which is the not involuntary part of the efferent division. So think of peristalsis with smooth muscles, or think of glands. And the autonomic nervous system is divided into two more parts, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is involved with fight or flight. And the parasympathetic nervous system is involved more with relaxation. And we'll talk more about these next episode. So I want to immediately start with the brain. So when developing the brain, the brain has primary vesicles, and these are the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. These will eventually form into secondary vesicles, which will form into the adult brain structures. The primary vesicles, so I already mentioned what the primary vesicles are, but the secondary vesicles are the telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, and metencephalon, and myelencephalon. And these will these form, so the prosencephalon forms the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The mesencephalon stays the mesencephalon. The rhombencephalon forms the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. So now let's talk about the cerebrum. It's made up of two hemispheres, two lobes, and three layers. So right here in this picture, you can see the two hemispheres, the right and left hemisphere, and you can see their four lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Then there, inside this area, there's actually something called the insula. I won't be able to mention much about it, but I just wanted to mention it now. The layers are the cerebral cortex. I don't know why it says cortex, but that's and the cerebral cortex is basically gray matter. And then after that, there's the cerebral white matter underneath it that makes up a lot of it. And then after that, there's the basal ganglia, or the basal nuclei, which it should be called. But the basal ganglia consists of several parts: the caudate nucleus, um, the putamen area, the globus pallidus, the amygdaloid body. We won't really talk about these that much. So now let's talk about the diencephalon. The diencephalon is it connects the cerebrum to the brainstem. It has the thalamus, which is like a relay station from for nervous impulses from um, spinal cord to the cerebrum, and some impulses are just like sorted out here before being transmitted again. Um, Sensations such as pain, pressure, and sensitivity or to temperature are also evaluated here. The epithalamus contains the pineal gland. We'll learn more about that in the endocrine system. And but it helps with the circadian cycles, which are sleep cycles. Then after that, there's the hypothalamus, which has many different body activities. It controls the autonomic nervous system, regulates emotion, behavior, hunger, thirst, body temperature, and the biological clock or circadian cycles. And I'm saying this from a book, so cliff notes, please don't sue me. Anyway, so whoops. Um, Now let's just talk a little bit about the brain stem. The brain stem consists of the reticular formation, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain is the uppermost area. The pons is the middle area. Medulla oblongata is the lowest area. The reticular formation is just a bunch of white matter, just small clusters of, or not white matter, gray matter, small clusters of gray matter just scattered around. And it contains the reticular activation system, which is responsible for alertness and wakefulness. Then there's the cerebellum. I didn't mention here. That's not part of the brainstem, but it's right here. And this is actually in charge of evaluating motor movements. They compare and balance. They compare the movement that you made from the movement that you originally intended. Anyway, so now let's talk about the limbic system. The limbic system deals with many different functions, mainly memory and emotion, and it consists of the hippocampus, which is in charge of memory, dentate gyrus, cingulate gyrus, amygdala, mammillary bodies, the anterior thalamic nuclei, and the fornix. And the fornix is basically just like a bundle of fiber tracts that link the whole limbic system up. So let's take a picture of this. So this is the brain stem once again, midbrain, pons, medulla. Then after that, there is the limbic system right here, and it contains the cerebral structures. So the hippocampus, the amygdala, the cingulate gyrus, the fornix, and the hypothalamus, or anterior thalamic nuclei. And I also forgot to mention these little grooves. These grooves and hills are called gyri and sulci and gyri, respectively. And deep grooves are called fissures. Your cerebellum has them, but they're called different names. The gyri is actually called something different. They're called folia. Moving on. So ventricles and the cerebrospinal fluid. So let's first talk about the cerebrospinal fluid. Its functions are to absorb shocks to the brain, more like physical shocks, not like nerve shocks. It distributes nutrients and waste, and removes waste, and it gives a chemically balanced environment for the brain. There are 4 ventricles, and they're noted by Roman numerals, not by how I've named them here, but they're the lateral ventricles, ventricles 1 and 2. Then there's the third ventricle, which is connected by the intraventricular foramen, is what it's called. And and then after that, there's the fourth ventricle. So cerebrospinal fluid that is here eventually flows into the spinal canal, or it can go into the subarachnoid space. But now let's just talk about the choroid plexus. Those are basically just capillaries projecting into ventricles, and these have a blood-brain barrier, which we'll talk about in a moment. So let's talk about the flow of cerebrospinal fluid through these ventricles first. So they go from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid space or the central spinal canal. Now, either way, they'll eventually go into the arachnoid villi and dural sinuses, and we'll talk about what this means later, and back to the blood. Now let's talk about let's just take a look at this right now. So you can see the lateral ventricle into here, into the lateral ventricles, into the third ventricle, into the fourth ventricle, and this will go down a canal in the spinal cord, or they'll go in arachnoid villi, which we'll talk about right now. So the dura mater, the meninges, that's basically like protective covering of the brain. There are three layers: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater contains venous sinuses, so contains venous blood, and continues to the spine is the dural sheath. The arachnoid mater has protrusions called the arachnoid villi, and these send cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space to the dural sinuses. So the subdural space is between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater, and then there's the subarachnoid space, which is below the arachnoid mater, and it contains a bunch of vessels and cerebrospinal fluid. And threads of tissue in here make it look kind of like a web, hence arachnoid. And then after that, there's the pia mater. It has blood vessels and is the innermost layer. So now let's talk about the blood-brain barrier. It describes the property of permeability of the blood vessels in the cerebrospinal fluid. So the endothelium of blood, the blood vessels have in the ventricles have cerebrospinal or have tight junctions, preventing bad substances from leaving into the blood into the brain cavities. Then after that, there's also a basal lamina, another layer that surrounds the capillaries, and you usually don't see this in blood vessels. And then after that, there are astrocytes as well, and we talked about this last episode, but they help keep ionic balance. You can't really see this, but let me move up. Cranial nerves. So there are 12 of them. I won't talk about them that much, but they pass through the skull foramina, and I will have a chart that you will need to memorize in the link in the description below. So now let's talk about the spinal cord. So it has several functions. It transmits nerve impulses and spinal reflexes. So it goes from the foramen magnum to the conus medullaris in the lumbar 1 vertebra. If you don't know what that means, you're going to have to go back to the skeletal system. So these are held by something called the filum terminale inferiorly, and along the spinal cord it's held by dendrite ligaments, or dentriculate ligaments. So spinal nerves emerge in pairs. The cervical plexus is on top, and then there's the cervical enlargement from C4 to T1, anterior median fissure. I won't talk about this really. I'll just show you a picture of it. So it's this. Memorize this picture. And then after that, but I do want to mention the cauda equina, so nerves attached from the bottom of that's basically like the end of the spinal cord, nerves attached to the bottom of the spinal cord, and those nerves, as they protrude, they go lateral. So cross sections of the spinal cord show things called roots, which are basically branches. So take a look at this picture. These branches are roots. So there are ventral roots, anterior roots, which contain motor nerve axons, and then after that, dorsal roots, which contain sensory fibers, and those are posterior. So gray matter is found in an H, so you see this H right here in the spinal cord. So the gray commissure is the crossbar of the H. The ventral horns, these contain somata of motor neurons in the lower portion of the H. And then the lateral horns, those are projections in the ventral horns, and these are only seen in thoracic and lumbar regions. These house cell bodies from the sympathetic nervous system. Then there's the central canal, which is a hole in the gray commissure containing cerebrospinal fluid. Oh, I forgot to mention dorsal horns, which are the upper part. And then after that, there's white columns, and we'll talk about those next episode. It seems that we're going to have 3 episodes, so I have to go. Bye.